Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Courtney, and thanks to all of you for showing up this evening. Tonight, the topic of our discussion is the Wheaton architecture of Jarvis Hunt. I thought I'd start out with a real quick slide on who I am. So I moved to Wheaton in 1975. I grew up on the south side of Wheaton near Kelly Park and the Chicago Golf Club. So I grew up close to many homes that were actually designed by the subject of tonight's lecture. I attended Whittier, Edison, and Wheaton Central. I earned degrees from Knox College, Northwestern University, and the University of Chicago. I lived in Chicago for a time, and in fact, I lived on one of the only streets where there's a Jarvis Hunt house in the city of Chicago. So that was, I don't know if you could call that kismet or what, but that was how that ended up working out. I was up on the north side. I've written for the Chicago Tribune since 1993. I often cover Wheaton in my coverage, but I really like houses and architecture. I write a real estate column for the Tribune right now, and I started taking a real interest in the history and the architecture of the homes around the Chicago Golf Club starting about 25 years ago. I currently also live in a house designed by Jarvis Hunt. So that's me. Let me talk about who was Jarvis Hunt, okay, and why he was important to Wheaton. So Jarvis Hunt, you see here, was born in 1863, died in 1941. He is, I would submit, the most prominent national architect to design the largest number of houses and buildings in Wheaton. Some bigger name architects did design works in Wheaton. Some designed as few as just one. Frank Lloyd Wright, unbeknownst to many, designed one house in an unincorporated area just south of Wheaton. Larry Booth is another. Other architects, like the in-house architects at home building companies, will design numerous homes that you'll find in a subdivision around town, but those architects' identities as in-house architects for home builders are largely unknown. Hunt, however, he was a prominent architect both nationally and a big one in the Chicago architectural community, and very prolific out here in DuPage County. So here's the man. This is a dashing photo of him. He did not like his photograph to be taken, so there are very few photos that exist of Jarvis Hunt. But this is one. You see he's a good-looking fellow there. And when we talk, we're going to talk a little bit about his upbringing in the East, in the Northeast. But first, I'd love to take a look at what it was he did actually in Wheaton, what the magnitude was, and then what the kinds of homes were that he designed. So he designed at least 21 single-family homes in Wheaton between 1896 and 1916. Could have designed as many as 27. There are some where documentation is just lacking. He also drew attention for a proposed redesign of downtown Wheaton in 1910, which we'll get to shortly. And he designed the Thornhill Mansion at what's now the Morton Arboretum. The portion he designed was torn down. Small amount of Thornhill remains, but it was a portion that was added onto later. Wheaton was settled by Northeasterners. Most of you probably know this. Warren Wheaton came to Wheaton from Pomfret, Connecticut, whereas Lyman Butterfield, who is arguably the first settler in Wheaton, he was born in New York State and came here by way of Ashtabula, Ohio. Jarvis Hunt, growing up in the Northeast in Vermont, was undoubtedly influenced by what he saw around him, and the kinds of architecture that he designed was shingle style, colonial revival, and it used a whole lot of stucco. And all of that, to me, strikes me as a nod to his upbringing in New England. So he was born in Wethersfield, Vermont. His parents were from some old colonial families. His father, Levitt, was the son of a United States congressman. His father served in the Civil War and was the first American to photograph the ruins of Egypt. Jarvis Hunt came from a family of tremendous accomplishment. His uncle was a sculptor and painter, but another uncle was a very well-known architect who many of you may have heard of, Richard Morris Hunt, who designed the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. He designed some mansions in Newport, Rhode Island, and he designed the massive Biltmore Mansion in Asheville, North Carolina. His mother came from a family that was equally significant. Her father, William Jarvis, had been the U.S. consul to Portugal, and he famously smuggled merino sheep out of Spain after Napoleon conquered Spain. So he brought merino sheep to the United States. He served as consul, returned to the United States in the early 1800s. This is a Google Images image of Jarvis Hunt's boyhood home. It still stands in Vermont. It's a large brick structure. It was built in the 1790s. It was expanded in 1810 and 1837. I've talked to the family that owns this home. There is a marker out in front of it. It was called Elms Home, and it's on the west bank of the Upper Connecticut River. The family lived there until 1942, which coincidentally is the year after Jarvis Hunt passed away. So this is Jarvis Hunt as a child. That's him on the upper right-hand corner. And then if you take a look here, what did he do in his early years? There's a lot of folklore about where he was educated and what he did. So in his boarding school years, he went to an Episcopal boarding school in Massachusetts. He was out of school for an entire year for scarlet fever, and he produced middling grades. I know because I've seen his report card, and it was not impressive in any subject. Then he went to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he studied for 1 year. There's a lot of chatter that he may have studied at Yale, that he might have studied at Harvard. There is no evidence of either one of those things. It's not known what he did between 1884 and 1890, but it's a safe bet he did some kind of draftsman work in Boston. In 1890, in the census, he was identified as a draftsman in Boston. First known designs were in 1891 in Massachusetts and in the state of Maine. He came to Chicago in 1892, submitted plans for a museum in Garfield Park, which is out on the west side of Chicago. That museum was never built. But what really got him going, career-wise, was the White City, the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. Congress, you may recall, chose Chicago, to host the World's Fair in 1893 to celebrate the 500th anniversary of Columbus coming to the New World. So what happened was Richard Morris Hunt was tasked to design the World's Columbian Exposition's administration building. And he had something that a lot of Chicagoans know and understand well, which is clout. And so he made use of that political clout by tapping his nephew, who really hadn't done very much up to that point, to design the state of Vermont's building. Now, at the World's Columbian Exposition down on the south side, all the states at that time had their own buildings. These buildings were they were temporary, and they were made of staff. Staff, I don't know how many of you know what staff is, but it's a weird mixture of plastic and fiber or straw, and it's temporary. It's easily dismantled, and it was. You also had a subscription plan where residents of the state of Vermont were leaned on, hey, can you contribute some money to our state building? The building cost $15,000. It was an ancient Roman villa was the design he used. As I said, it came down, as I write up here, it came down after the fair, but it clearly showcased what Jarvis Hunt could do. And it was a classical style, which we're going to see he did quite a bit of here in Wheaton and in the rest of his career. So from the fair, that really got his career going, and it really connected him with Chicago's business and social set. So he opened an office on the famed Monadnock block skyscraper in Chicago, and then he became deeply involved in a number of clubs. One was the Chicago Club, another was the Saddle and Cycle Club, which he helped to form, and then he took on scattered jobs throughout the 1890s, mostly through his club connections. When I've studied the jobs that he got, in almost every case, you can trace who the person was who hired him and why. He occasionally had office partners throughout his career, but he was largely a solo practitioner. His best-known partner was Andrew Robori, who worked with him from 1914 until 1918. Most of you know one of Andrew Robori's structures, which is the Wheaton Post Office, designed during the Depression. Robori also designed some structures out at Cantigny, including the burial spot out there. But there's no evidence that Hunt ever worked with any Wheaton architects. I really think he liked working on his own. So in the 1890s, here are some early commissions of his. He designed this building here. It was first an office building for a newspaper, and then later it was a hotel. He also designed 3 houses that are all adjacent to one another in Riverside. One of these was actually owned by Wheaton City Councilman John Prendeville before he moved to Wheaton. It's the one in the lower right-hand corner. John owned that. So what ultimately brought Jarvis Hunt to Wheaton from the city was the game of golf. So one of the Chicago Golf Club's co-founders, some of you may have heard of, his name is Charles Blair MacDonald. He was raised in Chicago, but when he was 16, he moved to Scotland to live with a grandfather. While he was there, he really took to the sport of golf, which had started taking off in Scotland, but not quite so much here in the States. So he came back to Chicago. He had to get a job at some point. He wasn't able to enjoy the life on the links his entire life. So he took a job working long hours as a stockbroker, but he couldn't kick the golf bug. And so Charles Blair MacDonald got together with some people to co-found what's now the Chicago Golf Club. They founded it in 1892, but they founded it at a small farm in Downers Grove called Belmont, you all probably know where Belmont Avenue is. But the club quickly outgrew that location. They needed more space, they needed 18 holes. So in 1894, they found a 200-acre farm about a mile south of downtown Wheaton on Warrenville Road. They bought that property and they moved in during the 1895 golf season. Jarvis Hunt was good friends with Charles Blair Macdonald. He was one of the earliest members of Chicago Golf. And he'd done this at the Saddle and Cycle Club, where he designed their clubhouse, did the same thing at the Chicago Golf Club. Now, there was already a building there, an Italianate-style farmhouse. So the members said, well, we don't want to tear this down. We'd like to expand it and renovate it. Jarvis Hunt did that. He put a big addition on the back of it. He altered the interior, and they started using it and playing golf there. From there, Chicago Golf turned into something of a summer resort. What was the reason a bunch of people from Chicago would want to come out here, of all places, 25 miles west? The reason was that in the 1890s and much later, cities were really, really dirty. The air was dirty, the air, you really felt like your lungs blackened living in the city. The idea, you'd come out to resorts to feel better. We didn't have medicine that we have today, the modern medicine, and so there was a belief in the medical community. You'd go to places where they had fresh air, and that was very easy for convalescing. On top of that, cities were incredibly unsafe. So a famous story people like to tell is if you belong to a club in the city and you were a member of that club, they'd give you a gun to take home with you for protection. Didn't need to worry about that out here in Wheaton. So what happened was the club members started billing this as a place where you'd come for the whole summer. If you had the money, if you didn't have to work, even if you did have to work, sometimes a husband would stay in the city during the week and the family, the wife and children would be out, staying out in Wheaton. And so that was what was billed as this resort at Chicago Golf. So initially there were some apartment cottages on the club grounds. But the Wheaton family, you all know, Jesse and Warren Wheaton, they actually came up with this idea that, hey, we could actually build houses, rent these out for the summer to club members. And so immediately they took to doing that. So they actually got together with Jarvis Hunt, they got to know each other, and they said, hey, start building some of these. We're gonna call these cottages. Even if they're quite large, we're gonna refer to them in the parlance of the day as cottages. So now we're gonna get to some of these cottages in a moment, but first I'll show you the Patrick Farmhouse. This is where Chicago Golf first met. This is where members got together and ate and drank and really just kicked back. And so then from there needed to be more housing. You had some existing farmhouses around Chicago Golf, and some of those owners started renting their properties out. They'd go somewhere else for the summer. But there was more housing needed, and it was needed fast. So in 1896, the Chicago Tribune reported that Jarvis Hunt had designed a number of cottages to be built on the Chicago Golf Club grounds. Now, that's just semantics. These were not actually built on the property. They were near the property. 3 of the buildings were, they called them English country cottage style. These actually wound up being shingle style houses. I'm going to show you their pictures, but it's possible that in 1896 they weren't using the term shingle style. Other people call them craftsman bungalow style, but they really resemble and feel, but not in scale, this massive mansion that Jarvis Hunt designed for the McCormick family up in Lake Forest called Walden. Walden was torn down in the 1950s, but regardless, you could call the mid-1890s Jarvis Hunt's shingle-style period. This is a house a lot of you are going to know. It's on Roosevelt Road. It was most recently a lawyer's office. Before that, it was a real estate office, but before that, it was actually a family home. Into the 1960s and 70s, a family lived in this home. You can see it's very much shingle-style, craftsman-style. Now, that's one of the 3 that was mentioned in 1896 in that news article. If you go to the next slide here, 819 Golf Lane here, right by Golf and Arbor, has some similarities, doesn't it? The physical exterior similarities are really quite similar. This was designed for another prominent member of the club. This is James Deering, whose father had founded the Deering Harvester Company. And some other members rented it as well. And like most of these homes that we're going to show, they were eventually winterized and made year-round residences. That didn't happen until the 1920s and 1930s. Up to that point, these tended to be summer homes, and when winter came, they shut them down. This is another one right across the street. This is 824 Golf Lane. I bet you all are sensing a theme right now in the appearance. They all look like they're part of a series. They're not identical, but they look very, very similar. So this was George Willetts' home. He was an early Chicago Golf Club member. He was a politician. People died young in those days. He died when he was at age 42 in 1898. He lived in this house for about 2 years, so not very long. It's a gorgeous little bungalow. It's right at the corner of Golf and Arbor. It recently sold. It's been redone. It looks magnificent. They've done a nice job with it. There was another, a number of these homes had coach houses and stables, and 819 Golf Lane, which I just showed you, had one of these. And the record shows that this house was actually dragged across the street in 1906 to its current location. It's now a single family house, but this had been one of these coach houses / stables. These were used to house carriages and horses, later automobiles. Sometimes you actually had servants actually living in these as well. There was another one. I showed you 824 Golf Lane. This one at 607 Arbor had been it had been the coach house for 824 Golf Lane, fell into disrepair in the 1970s and early 1980s, and it was demolished. So now you have one of those Earhart-style modern houses on its site. So it's a bit of a mishmash when you see it next to the 824 Golf Lane. And then Jarvis Hunt designed two more houses south of Arbor on Golf Lane, but these were Dutch colonial revival style homes, also designed to be rented out to Chicago Golf Club members, and again, funded by the Wheaton family. Jarvis Hunt didn't have a lot of cash in the 1890s, so he was very much cash poor, but idea rich, and so the Wheaton family partnered with him, and you'll see here, one of these you all probably know. This is the house at 910 Golf Lane. It actually was, for a time, owned by a judge in its early years, a DuPage County judge, but it has also been wonderfully preserved. It's been added on to, it's been modernized. The owners have done a great job with it. A little bit to the south of that was another house that was also Dutch colonial revival, and that's 924 Golf Lane. If you take a close look at that, the picture on the left is really unusual because it was taken in 1912. So shortly, less than 20 years after it was built, call it 16 years afterward. So this is what it looked like back then. You'll see there's almost nothing behind it. You see it's just a lot of open field. There wasn't much going on. The photo on the right is a township assessor photo from the early 1980s. There was also, as there so often was, a coach house, and that's 614 Arbor Avenue here, another colonial revival style house. Its architectural features are very consistent with Hunt's other work. It's got what's called a side gambrel roof. And yes, if you look at it closely, the owner appears to be looking at me as I take this photograph. So what Jarvis Hunt then did was some of the members of the club wanted to actually own their own property. They didn't want to own properties on city lots. They wanted to own a much larger parcels. But more than that, they were interested in owning these properties, not necessarily living in them year round, but they wanted much bigger homes in scale. So starting in 1897, Jarvis Hunt designed 4 large houses immediately to the west and south of Chicago Golf. And those were for members who actually, again, were going to own them. And they were a real potpourri of different styles. You had a Tudor revival style, you had a colonial style, colonial revival style, and Romanesque revival style. It's hard to know how these styles were chosen. It's probable that the owners actually chose those styles. Don't know for sure. 3 of those homes still stand. This was mentioned in the February 21st, 1897 Chicago Tribune. Several houses are in course of construction, I love this, on the small hills adjacent to the Chicago Golf Club grounds by various members of the club. Jarvis Hunt is identified as the architect. First one is a house that's gotten a lot of attention locally in the last few years. That's the House of Seven Gables, which Loretto Convent had owned. It is at the address of 141 Loretto Court. This is what the drawing looked like in the Chicago Tribune when it was being constructed. For those of you who know what it looks like, it looks very similar today to what you see in that drawing. Now, let's flash forward to today. This is a convent owned it. Chicago Golf Club, different Chicago Golf Club members owned it. The guy who built it was Jay Morse. He was a steel executive. He built it for his daughter and her husband. And the folklore is that it was a wedding present. That's hard to see. It was built in 1897. They got married in 1889. So that folklore is ever present around Wheaton. I don't believe that. But unfortunately, death and divorce were just constants throughout the Chicago Golf Club colony. Jay Morse and his daughter and her husband got divorced at some point, and she moved up to Lake Bluff. She sold the house, moved up to Lake Bluff, and right on Lake Michigan on the North Shore. So some other Chicago Golf Club families then owned that house, and then in 1946, the Wetmore family sold it to the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary, otherwise known as Loretto Convent. It was owned by the convent. They attached a chapel to it, and it was stood in that location, had a variety of uses by the convent for 71 years. Convent moved out in 2017 when they sold it for a subdivision, which got a lot of attention. You'll see, this is a picture of it from roughly 1910 here on the left. You see, this is long before the chapel has been attached. This is when it was still in private ownership. On the right here is what happened after 2017. Most of you know the house was relocated to a new site about 500 or 600 feet to the south. In this picture here on the right, you'll see Assistant City Manager John Duguay, City Manager Mike Dugan, Lori Warfel, and yes, that is Nancy Flannery on the far right in this photograph during the house's move. The house is presently being renovated for use as a single-family home. One of the other homes he designed, which is immediately west of Chicago Golf, is Ballyshear. This one was built for Charles Blair Macdonald, Chicago Golf Club's co-founder. This was his own home. If you take a look at it, it's just a gorgeous, gorgeous home. This is a photo from overhead. Number of prominent local families have lived in it over the years: the Rutherfords, the Vincents, the Filkins, and the Krausers. This is an up-close photo of it, and I gotta tell you, I could just look at this all day. It's a lovely, lovely house. The proportions, I think, are fabulous on it, and the interior has been renovated really, really nicely. So why don't I let you guys take a peek inside of it. So here in 1898, the National House Beautiful magazine actually ran a photograph, numerous photographs of the interior, and you'll see what they said. From the hall, the stairway naturally and gracefully ascends. Mr. Jarvis Hunt, who designed the house, is noted for these exquisite curves. The hall is wainscoted to the ceiling in white enameled wood paneling, and the stairway is of the same white with crimson carpeting. Now take a look at the real estate listing photograph on the right for Ballyshear from this past year when the property sold. You can see it's almost identical. You can see how little really has been changed between 1898 and 2018. A third house that Jarvis Hunt designed was immediately south of Ballyshear. It was called Overlinks, and this was built for an influential member of the Board of Trade named Edward S. Worthington. Unfortunately, as I said, death was ever present in this community. He died in 1898. He died 1 year after his house was built. This sat on about 3.5 acres, and what's unfortunate about it is it was torn down. In 1989, 2 houses were put up on its place. This was a colonial revival house. It is really hard to find good photographs of Overlinks. I remember looking at it as a boy on my bike. Now I'm kicking myself that I didn't borrow my mom's camera and take pictures of it at the time. There's a nice aerial photograph of it here. There's a very grainy photograph on the right from 1902, but it is very hard to find photos of Overlinks, and I have tried. So I will tell you, I've talked to some of the previous owning families, and this is the best that we've been able to do up to now. So here is the Gate Lodge. This was the 4th house that Jarvis Hunt designed west of or south of Chicago Golf. This Gate Lodge and Stables is a very, very horizontal house right up against Plamondon Road. Most of you know if you're heading south from town down to Orchard Road, it's on the left. It is widely known around town because it has a driveway that goes underneath and or through the house, you'd say. Romanesque revival style. Here's a rendering of it from the 1897 Chicago Tribune. Photograph on the right is one from sometime in the early 1900s. I want to say that's 1902. And what's happened fairly recently, it was bought in 2010, underwent a very, very faithful restoration. Let's take a look at some current photographs. This one on the left here was taken before it sold, so call that 2009. These 2 on the right were taken, I think, on Wednesday. So that should give you a current view of what it looks like. I apologize for how dark these are on the right, but I highly recommend going down and taking a look at it because the owner has done a wonderful, wonderful job with it. With all this building going on in the area around Chicago Golf, one club member didn't have a house yet himself, and that's actually Jarvis Hunt. The man himself, most of the time, was crashing, from what the record shows, in cottages, brick cottages on the site of Chicago Golf. However, in 1898, he built his own house, a 2-story Spanish colonial revival house. I'm going to come back to this slide, but I'd like to show you what it looked like. This house was on Hawthorne Lane. It was on the east side of Hawthorne Lane on what eventually became a 29-acre spread that he had. He bought a 29-acre estate on a rise that faced Chicago Golf, offered a terrific view both of the club and of the clubhouse. Now, in 1898, he had not done anything other than modernize that farmhouse that I showed you that was their clubhouse. Stay tuned, because his view fairly soon is going to get a lot more interesting. So we'll get to that in a moment. But these are some images of this house. What always stuck out at me was that it had this Spanish-styled roof. And I just thought that was the neatest thing as a kid when I would go up and down the street looking at it. But it was a terrific, terrific house. One of the things Jarvis Hunt was famous for was putting portico shares on houses. And he liked stucco, as I said. This one had a lot of stucco. But there was a tremendous amount of folklore with this house. The most common story told was that he would ride his horse into the dining room for dinner. He had a stuffed crocodile on the floor. It's hard to know how much of this is actual and how much of this isn't. He owned it until 1934, had a number of subsequent owners, the Stevens, the Cushing, and the Donovan families. The Donovans are the family who most people associate the house with. They owned it for 25 years. It was torn down, unfortunately, in February of 1984. I know this for a fact because I have the article from when it was torn down in the Wheaton Daily Journal. It was on the front page of the Wheaton Daily Journal, the demolition of that house. So I took my bike past it right as it was being cleared away, and it was very, very unfortunate. It's a shame. I wish that his own house could have been saved. At present, a new house is being built on the site of his old house. I'm going to show you now on this map. Let's take a look at where Jarvis Hunt actually, his house was in relation to everything else. So I was talking a little bit earlier about, this is Chicago Golf here. If you look over here, this is where the gatehouse is. This is where Ballyshear is. This is where Overlinks is. His own property was this trapezoidal type parcel here. And again, 29 acres. You got the Wheaton Cemetery here. Up here, this horizontal road is Roosevelt Road. This is Warrenville Road turning into Plamondon Road here. And then finally, the golf lane houses that I talked about, those were all up in this area here. So that should give you all some sense of proportion about how close everyone and everything was to one another. He wasn't done designing houses in that area. He designed one more house in Wheaton for the time being in the late 1890s. This was an owned house. This was not owned by the Wheaton family. This is now on what's called Fraser Court, if you all know where this is. It's 619 Fraser. It was originally named 926 Golf Lane because originally Golf Lane was its address. But this fellow who Jarvis Hunt designed it for was another Chicago Golf Club member, Charles Strobel. He was a prominent engineer who actually had a hand in developing the concept of steel skeleton construction for office buildings. So he was a very, very important person in the Chicago building community. It was completed in 1899. Some of you may remember that this had a devastating fire in 2011 while it was being remodeled, made the papers, and it has since been completely restored and it is currently for sale. I'd like to shift gears now and talk about Jarvis Hunt's personal life. He got married in 1899. He was, at the time, 36 years old. And what happened was he married Louise Cobb Coleman, who was 15 years younger than he was. So she was 21. She was an avid equestrian, and she came from something approaching Chicago royalty herself. Her family is the Coleman family, but her ancestors were the Cobb family, who were a very old and very important Chicago family in the mid and early 1800s. She descended from that family, and her family had plenty of money. They lived both in Chicago, and they had a place out in Warrenville, what's now Warrenville, out on Batavia Road. So the two of them married in 1899, and they adopted 2 children. It's not known why they adopted and didn't have their own children. I have no information about that. But what I do know is the 2 children lived into the 1970s. The 2 of them were married and divided their time between Chicago and Wheaton for the next 9 years. What happened was in 1908, behind their house, they had a wood stable because, again, she was quite an equestrian. Unfortunately, that wood stable burned to a crisp in 1908. They noticed the fire from Chicago Golf, where they were sitting and hanging out. She was mortified. She got a bunch of members to effectively function as a bucket brigade, and they barreled over to the stable, rescued all of their horses. No horses perished. Unfortunately, the stable was a total loss. And so from there, they quickly rebuilt with a really handsome brick stable. brick is better than wood when it comes to fire. And that stood until the early 1970s. Now, I'll show you that stable in a moment. But that was unfortunately not a stable Louise Hunt was going to enjoy for much longer, because in 1909, the couple underwent a high-profile divorce. It took place in a 6-minute closed hearing in a DuPage County courthouse. Their divorce made the front pages of the papers for several days because they were both in society, but also because there had been allegations of infidelity, so that was very scandalous, and because they both allegedly received special treatment from the court system. Now, Jarvis Hunt, after that, never remarried. His sister functioned as his escort at a number of social functions until she herself got married to an Episcopal priest in the later part of the 19-teens. His ex-wife did remarry, but died very young. She was 39 years old when she died in 1917, and she inexplicably surrendered custody of the children. So Jarvis Hunt had custody of the children for the rest of their lives, or their childhoods, I should say. Jarvis Hunt then, much later in his life, he divided his time between Wheaton and Chicago, and then eventually between Wheaton, Chicago, and a retirement home in Phoenix. It's not clear how involved of a parent he was. He seemed to send his children off to boarding school, from what we can tell. Here's Louise Hunt here, that she looked like. And if you see the picture on the right from a Chicago newspaper, that is a very rare photograph of Jarvis Hunt wearing the hat there. Again, did not like to be photographed, and there are very few photos that exist of him. More entertaining, I think you'll find, is this editorial cartoon from the Chicago Inter-Ocean newspaper. If you look closely, you'll see it says here, "Divorce a la mode," and it shows society figure on the left, society figure on the right, and it says here, "Extra session divorces while you wait." And you see the bailiffs hastening or working hard to keep the door closed. Down below, you see divorce ordinary. You see quite a raucous courtroom. Bailiff on the left is yelling, "Oyez, oyez." And you see any other man, any other woman, and you see the room is just full of people. So they certainly were mocked pretty significantly for that divorce. If you look here, these are some rare photographs that my friend David Tabor loaned me. These are the brick stable that stood until the early 1970s right behind Jarvis Hunt's own home. What I like was a 1909 news article that said here, Mrs. Hunt often sat and watched her trainers run her horses up and down the driveway to the main road. They describe it as being a Georgian-style architecture. Yeah, I could call that Georgian, I think. But I look at this and I think, man, I wish I could have seen this in person. I think it's just a neat looking building. And you don't run across a huge number of brick stables, I don't think. So I'd like to shift gears now, if it's okay, and talk about some of Jarvis Hunt's national work. I haven't really spent time talking about his work outside the Midwest or really about Wheaton, because this is a talk about Wheaton architecture. But I do think it's fair that I give you some sense of what it was he did that made him so significant nationally. So what happened was he did some work in the 1890s and during the aughts, the first decade of the 20th century, outside the Midwest, but that work really intensified starting around 1909. From there, he began undertaking a huge number of railroad commissions, including railroad depots and office buildings in some major cities. One was in Joliet, but others were in Kansas City, Dallas, Houston, Omaha, and Oakland. He also designed office buildings and department stores all over the country: Indianapolis, Newark, Pittsburgh, St. Paul, Washington, D.C. He designed an academic building up on the campus of the University of Wisconsin. His work had one constant, which is he often employed classical styles. Triple-arched motifs were what you'd see in his rail depots. You'd see Beaux-Arts elements, like you saw in that hotel and newspaper office building I showed you. The club network, again, was how his steady stream of clients came to be. So if you look here, this is one of his most significant works of all, the Kansas City Union Station, which was the second largest railroad depot in the United States. Note the triple-arched theme there that you see. Classical styles. He went one step further and tried to design the entire plaza around it. Had a lot of support from the Kansas City business community, a couple of the big leaders there, and from some of the railroad executives as well. And so that station has been marvelously preserved and is really a showplace now for the residents of Kansas City. That preservation only happened in the late 1990s. Another one he did was in Joliet. I realize this isn't national, but it's far away from Wheaton. The Joliet Union Station also has been recently restored. A microbrewery recently opened in there. It's not being used as a train station anymore, but the large waiting room you see inside the triple arched windows there on the second level is available for weddings and other functions, which I think is outstanding that it's being used that way. Let me show you some national work that were houses: Cleveland, Maine, and Milwaukee. So if you look here in the lower left-hand corner, you see some real resemblance here to the House of Seven Gables in Wheaton with these gables here. This is called Moyenage. He designed this for Jay Morse, the same person who is his client for the House of Seven Gables. This is right on the shore of Lake Erie in a suburb of Cleveland called Bratenahl. If you look in the middle there, this was a mansion he designed in Camden, Maine. He designed that for a gentleman named William Borden, who was a Chicagoan. That was 1903. And then if you look on the right, he designed a shingle-style house in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Tell me that that doesn't look a lot like the kind of house you'd see on Golf Lane in Wheaton, right? Very, very similar. Let's go back to Wheaton now. So he designed the Hurley Mansion in 1902. Some of you are familiar with this because it was on the property of Marion Joy and the Wheaton Franciscan Sisters. They bought it in 1947. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? It was a year earlier that the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary, the Ladies of Loretto, bought that house south of Chicago Gulf. 1 year later, the Franciscan Sisters bought a large property, and that's where they made their home, where they developed Marion Joy, Canticle Place, and others. This building no longer exists. It was a single-family house. It was owned by the Hurley family. Edward Hurley was a Chicago Golf Club member, and he bought a large piece of property and wanted, and it was, I mean, he had 100 acres. And so he had developed the pneumatic tool industry, hired Jarvis Hunt. Eventually, the Hurley family sold it to the Wheaton Franciscan Sisters, had a number of different uses. It was torn down, sadly, in 2009. This here is the Allen Reed House, which some people in town know as the Fairbanks House. He designed this in 1903. This is right next door to Jarvis Hunt's own home on Hawthorne Lane in Wheaton. It was designed for Allen Reed, who was a fairly prominent Chicago Golf Club member and golf pioneer. Allen Reed didn't live there very long. He lived there only 8 years. After that, Jarvis Hunt rented the house out. He sold it to the Dyke family. In 1947, Mrs. Dyke, who lived in the house, fell down the stairs and died. And her house servant, who was a Japanese, he was immediately taken into custody and committed to the state mental institution at Elgin, implicated in what was ruled to be a murder. Looking back, it was 2 years after World War II. There was a tremendous panic about the Japanese. It's hard to imagine that the gentleman, his name was Taro Okuchi, it's hard to imagine that he got anything resembling due process whatsoever. That took place. After that, several more families owned it. It was torn down in 2012. Sadly, I have a photograph of it during demolition there on the right. New house was constructed on the site in 2017. Some of you know where St. James Farm is. That was owned by Brooks McCormick, and before that by his parents, Chauncey McCormick and Marion Deering McCormick. Jarvis Hunt designed the McCormick's family house at St. James Farm. He designed it for yet another Chicago Golf Club member. This one was Chicago Edison Company founder Frank Gorton. Two-story, Georgian style. Eventually, the McCormicks got their hands on it. In the 1950s, after Chauncey McCormick died, Brooks McCormick overhauled it and made it completely unrecognizable. So Brooks McCormick died in 2006. 6 years earlier, he'd sold St. James Farm to the Forest Preserve with the idea that he could live on it until he passed away. He also bribed, or that's the wrong word, he offered added money. It was an inducement to the district. Hey, will you take this extra money from me if you'll tear down my house? I don't want people to look at the house I lived in. Unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. The Forest Preserve took them up on that. So this is what it looked like in its early years on the left. Again, I said it was Georgian style. If you look at it on the right there, those photos were taken in 2007. I took those photos, I hopped a fence, and I took those photos shortly before it was torn down. So you see the house on the right looks very little like the house on the left. The one thing that the McCormicks did, they painted in that trademark yellow that all the buildings are painted in at St. James Farm, you all are familiar with. They'd gotten that style from some time they'd spent in Russia. You all probably have heard of that before. Jarvis not only designed a couple more houses in Wheaton, he designed this house here for the Herbert Tomlinson, yet another Chicago Golf Club member. This is on the north side of Wheaton. You all may know this house, I would think. It's at the corner of Lincoln and Ellis, and you've seen it. The Carlson family most famously owned it from the 1940s until the 1960s. But if you look at it really closely, it just bears a tremendous resemblance to some of those homes to one of the homes on Gulf Lane that I showed you. You have a real symmetry to it. You've got very similar window treatments and styles. Again, shingle siding. Again, this one still stands and has been kept up very, very nicely. He did only a little bit more work in Wheaton after that. He designed a railroad station, a very small brick station for the Chicago Golf Club, for the Aurora, Elgin, and Chicago Railroad. The railroad went in 1902, and it was an easy way for Chicago Golf Club members to get to the club. It stopped right across Plamondon Road from the club. So what happened was, during the rest of the aughts, that first decade of the 20th century, Hunt didn't do much in Wheaton. However, he did design, again, some brick cottages at Chicago Golf and that brick station for the railroad. The brick cottages came down about 2004. Unfortunately, the brick railroad station came down when the railroad was abandoned in the early 1960s. Here are a couple of the only known photos of that brick station. I love looking at this station, I have to say. I don't know why. It seems like it's just like a warming shed. It certainly it wasn't heated, it wasn't staffed, but the fact that it was so attractive when other stations along the line were just slapped together wood tells you that the club members wanted something special for their members. This is where they would sit and wait for a train to take, it was on the club side, so this is where they would wait for a train to take them back to downtown Wheaton and perhaps back to downtown Chicago. So here's I promised you the proposed remaking of downtown Wheaton. This, to me, is fascinating. In House Beautiful magazine, which is a national magazine in 1910. It also appeared in Western Architect magazine. Jarvis Hunt proposed redoing Front Street. Does the top picture look familiar to any of you? He proposed redoing their facades with a plastered cement shell. And the idea would be you'd have an arch over Main Street as well. And the Western Architect magazine called it Elizabethan. Well, I don't know, I wouldn't call it Elizabethan style. I might call it Tudor or Tudor Revival. I'm not sure, maybe some of you have a suggestion. But let me tell you, Hunt was very publicly vocal about his plan. And that's great, but he was also very publicly critical of what stood there. He said it was a little English, a little touch of German, and it was all planned by a Yankee. He also said perhaps it's just Wheaton-esque. He also said the current block appears irregular and monotonous. So his lengthy quote here, I'll spare you reading all of it, but he did say we'll put Wheaton on the map all right. He had no shortage of self-confidence. And what he said, unfortunately, toward the bottom, this could not have gone over well with the townspeople. He said that this section chosen has been an eyesore ever since it was put up. It gave travelers a bad impression of the town before they got off the train, and as a result, its prosperity has suffered. Outside the business district, the place, meaning Wheaton, is the prettiest imaginable. And as soon as the business portion is bettered, we will boom to beat the band. So this proposal for downtown Wheaton never was actually adopted. However, what's interesting, it was abandoned in 1910. The building's owners, surprise, surprise, decided not to sign off on the project, even though the Wheaton Commercial Club did support it. It's hard not to assume that the residents, particularly building owners, were very offended by these comments. Several weeks later, the Wheaton, Illinois newspaper published a front-page editorial cartoon mocking Jarvis Hunt's plan. You can actually see a rendering of the plan up top with Wheaton's new front, and you see Uncle Sam on the right saying, "Can such things be?" And you see the townspeople here all of a sudden are becoming Englishmen. They're wearing, "Righto, time for tea, old chap. 5 o'clock tea." Someone says on the right there, "Good morning, fancy meeting you here, fancy," and they call that the Wheaton greeting. You see here a London cravat, a Piccadilly hat, an English walking stick, and yes, the lower right-hand corner says, "Dear no, I live at Wheaton, you know," and the other one says, "Ever get homesick, old chap?" Now, this never happened, and Jarvis Hunt never was able to say he had that last laugh, but more than 100 years later, downtown Wheaton's streetscape continues to be a frequent topic of both discussion and action, as I think you all this past year or two are painfully aware. So Jarvis Hunt also employed roughly that same architectural style for proposed downtown phase. He had an idea for a downtown Aurora, Elgin, and Chicago depot. I pulled this from an obscure journal called the Electric Railway Journal. It says at the bottom there, Jarvis Hunt, architect, at least I think it does. Yeah, well, it says it in the article. Unfortunately, that design was not adopted, and a different architect wound up actually designing that station. It was a more modest one-story brick station that some of you may remember that stood until 1966. Before I get to Jarvis Hunt's final houses in Wheaton, I want to talk about some of the planning visionary ideas that he had, only because what you saw in downtown Wheaton, you saw from him again and again. He was brash, he was opinionated, but he really had this idea of improving the aesthetics and the functionality of the communities around him. So he came up with all these ideas. He proposed, for instance, in 1912 to develop a central Union Station in the South Loop, downtown Chicago. Did not get adopted. Instead, Union Station was built to the west. He proposed straightening out the Chicago River south of downtown. He proposed a necklace of large islands in Lake Michigan off the Chicago shoreline for both recreational and commercial use. He proposed a system of downtown subways and a network of suspended elevated monorail cars. And he came up with a duplex elevator concept, as well as he won a patent for a vertically looped elevator system. And he also earned several other federal patents for inventions as diverse as golf balls and sprinkler heads for fire extinguishers. Only a couple more homes left. He designed the Stack and Sutherland Polo Farm residence on Roosevelt Road. Some of you may remember this. This was torn down the late 50s or the early 60s. Do any of you know who the Hollywood actor Robert Stack was from The Untouchables? His father was a Chicago Golf Club member. He was an ad man in Chicago, James L. Stack. The elder Stack bought a farm in late 1909. This is where the Trees of Wheaton development is located. If some of you know where that is, streets like Woodcutter and others are in there. And what happened was he loved polo. So he installed a polo field on his property, and at some point after buying the property, he built a house. There's no definitive evidence that Jarvis Hunt designed it, but if you look closely, many of the features resemble those of other Jarvis Hunt designed mansions, and they were both club members. Later on, there were plans for a hospital on this site in the late 50s and early 60s, and that fell through, so now that's where the Trees of Wheaton is. Then I promised you I'd talk about Thornhill down at the Morton Arboretum. This is what Thornhill looked like when it stood in all its glory. This is what Jarvis Hunt designed. So I've been talking about how some people, even like Brooks McCormick, wanted their homes torn down. That's what happened with the Mortons. The Morton Arboretum, Joy Morton had been a longtime client of Jarvis Hunt's. He'd used Jarvis Hunt for business work for the Morton Salt Company, Chicago office building. He actually had Jarvis Hunt renovate the Arbor Lodge family homestead out in Nebraska. So he hired Jarvis Hunt to design this country home. Back then they didn't use the name Lyle, they called it south of Glen Ellen. And he designed a half-timbered stucco house with a tile roof. And then he designed one addition to it. But then two more additions were put on later by other architects. Why did Jarvis Hunt not do those? My conclusion is that Jarvis Hunt was busy doing national work, all these railroad stations of which I spoke earlier. Morton, he kept renovating Thornhill. He kept redesigning it. I think he removed the half timbering. Joy Morton died in 1934. His second wife died in 1940. And after that, much of Thornhill sadly was torn down, including all of Hunt's portions. The only portion that remains is the library, and again, that was not designed by Jarvis Hunt. I told you I was going to mention the Chicago Golf Club clubhouse, which Jarvis Hunt was going to have a great view of right out the window of his house. So in 1912, that original Patrick farmhouse I showed you, that caught fire, possibly from an overheated stove in the kitchen. There were strong winds, and as you all probably know, 100 years ago, things just burned all the time. There were fires all the time. There were no best practices. Firefighters actually arrived on horseback. The record shows it was more than a mile away, and some fire department hose couplings, I love this, were not consistent with the hydrant connections of the club's private water system. So, not surprisingly, that Patrick farmhouse was a total loss. And so immediately the club said, hey, would you be able to design our clubhouse? Of course, Jarvis Hunt would do so for free. He designed a new 3-story stucco and brick clubhouse for $60,000. He had his usual bravado. He said the clubhouse will be commodious and simple and practically fireproof. When finished, it will undoubtedly be the prettiest of its kind in the country. That was the way Jarvis Hunt talked. It opened in 1913. It's hard to say what its style is. I'll let you all take a look at it. You all probably know it. I think it's just gorgeous. Some called it Georgian at the time. The interior motif was described as resembling a Pennsylvania manor house of the time of William Penn. Today, some people call it Tudor Revival. So it's tough. You know, it is really a mix. What you do see with these gables are some of the same things you see in the House of Seven Gables. Again, you see he really liked cupolas a lot. So you see that one there, that it's like a clock tower. He did that on the Saddle and Cycle Club. So he invoked a number of the styles that he'd used previously. Let's get to his final work in Wheaton. So he finally, in the mid-19-teens, he decided to build out more of his 29 acres in Wheaton. I've already shown you the Fairbanks house. I've shown you his own house. There's some dispute over what he did after that. There's one article that says he put up 4 houses. Another one says he put 2 houses up, one to the right and one to the left of him. So did he build 2 or did he build 4? It's clear that he built at least 2 more. One was at 1S617 Hawthorne Lane, one's at 1S751 Hawthorne Lane. I'm going to talk first about 1S751 Hawthorne Lane. The Tribune article describes the lower part having gray stucco, so it's possible that the upper part was actually shingle, some kind of shingle, and it was later. It's now you'll see all stucco. It's hard to know for sure, but what happened was it wasn't uncommon for Hunt to have 2 different forms, one on the first floor, one on the second floor. It's also possible the north and south ends of the house were sleeping porches and were enclosed later on. He rented it out to a family named the Fox family. They were just avid entertainers. They didn't have any children, but they had a ton of what was called in the newspapers furry figures. They had dogs, they had cats. They called their house Blue Fox Manor. They were really known for having Sunday lunches and bridge parties afterward. They had 4 small lakes on the property. It sounds like the most lovely place to spend an afternoon. So today the house is not blue, it's yellow and it's all stucco. The other house is 1S617 Hawthorne Lane. Some of you will recognize this house here. This is what it looks like. And here it was rented out for bachelor occupancy, is how that news article described. And indeed, it was rented out to a bachelor. It was a Chicago Golf Club member named Harvey Carbaugh. He was in the Spanish-American War, and he later was a judge advocate in the Philippines. It's not known when he started renting it, but he actually paid taxes on it even though he didn't own it. That was a common thing that was done back in that era. So he would varyingly call it either Lonelyhurst or Lonelyville, or Lonesomehurst, which is amusing. The Balaban family later, you may be familiar with them, the Chicago theater people, they rented it for 1 summer, either 1921 or 1922, before Elmer Balaban died around the year 2000. I talked to him and he confirmed that had been folklore we'd always heard, and he absolutely confirmed that. He said they moved out there for the summer because he had a sister who was very sick and they thought the fresh air would do her good. The house was later owned by the Bryant, the French, the Shoecraft, and the Graham families. And again, here's 1S617 Hawthorne Lane. That's a 2016 photo on the right. This is a photo from the 1969 when it was up for sale. You can see the similarities. Some other Wheaton area works, I'll wrap up with this. Some other Wheaton area works that Hunt may have designed, but we don't know. There just isn't the information. Unfortunately, there's no documentation. These are the Alice apartments. These were right in downtown Wheaton, right where townhomes exist today. Some of you will remember there was a bank building here for a long time. It's at the northeast corner of West and Wesley, but a lot of the features strongly resemble Jarvis Hunt's designs. What you see here, a couple things that are worth pointing out. You have a lot of classical features, but you really have these 12/1 and 9/1 windows. That was something Jarvis Hunt did, and not many other architects you would see doing that in Wheaton. In addition, it was owned by and built by a contractor named DeGrassi. He was a gentleman who Jarvis Hunt used a ton to build homes that he designed. Another possible Jarvis Hunt work is Villa Azura, a house on Plamondon Road. It's right in there with those others, but it was built later. So the ones I showed you, Ballysharon, Overlinks, and that gatehouse, it's right adjacent to those, but it wasn't built for another almost 20 years after that. It's possible that's one of the 4 houses that was referenced, even though it's not on Hunt's own property, and indeed is all the way across the club from it. But that's for many years, that was the Stair family's house. This was built for a Chicago Golf Club member named A.J. Partridge, and it's very secluded. It's just a gorgeous, gorgeous house. A couple others that he may have designed. This is up on the north side of Wheaton. This is 1115 North Wheaton Avenue, and it had been the clubhouse for the Gentlemen's Driving Park racetrack. That was just a betting track. But back in the early part of the 20th century, betting was, calling something a betting track, sounded kind of unsavory. So you'd refer to these things as a driving park. No, it was just a place where you'd go and place bets. After that closed, this house was moved from that site, which is a few blocks to the east, to its present location. We think that was done sometime in the 1920s. And again, one of the people behind the Gentleman's Driving Park racetrack was Frank Gorton. He was that Chicago Edison Company founder I mentioned who designed the house that ended up at St. James Farm. A couple more and then I'm done here. This is the Pogue School and Sanitarium. Some of you will remember this. It was at the corner of Main and Geneva, where the Jewel is now, the southeast corner of Main and Geneva. It was a school and sanitarium for many, many years. It was clearly built, originally this was a house, and it was built for a Chicago Golf Club member in the 1890s, but it was pretty small. And later, a Chicago Golf Club charter member paid a certain amount of money for it, sold it 8 years later for 3 times that amount. It's easy to think that he actually hired Jarvis Hunt to do some kind of expansion or renovation, probably fairly significant. It was torn down in 1970. Here's a portico share. You see, it was later enclosed, very similar to what you saw on the house at 1S 751 Hawthorne Lane. But again, we don't know. So it's just there's no documentation one way or another. Another house that Jarvis Hunt may have and probably designed is 1S 785 Hawthorne Lane. This one you'll see it's stucco. It was added on to several times. It may originally have been a farmhouse or some kind of stable that predated his ownership of those 29 acres on Hawthorne Lane. It was added on to in 1937, but some of the interior features were striking in how much it resembled the house next door at 1S 751 Hawthorne Lane. So it was on his own property. He clearly had a hand in doing some work on it, if not designing the vast majority of it. That was torn down in September of 2017, unfortunately. And then finally, this is a house that actually stood where we are right now. This was on the library property. This was at 201 East Wesley. This is known as the Reber House. Some of you may remember this. This stood for many, many years. It was torn down about 1971 to make way for an eventual library addition. It was built by William Phipps Adams. He was the son of John Quincy Adams, not the president, but his distant relative who owned the house where Central Park, Adams Park is, forgive me, Adams Park. And so William Phipps Adams was his son. This is very close, right across the street from Adams Park. And it's highly likely that William Phipps Adams hired Jarvis Hunt to design this house. It was built in 1896. You can see a lot of the features look like what Jarvis Hunt was designing in those years on Golf Lane. Let me wrap up with Jarvis Hunt's life. His final years, in his final decade of work, he came home. He stopped really designing almost anything outside of the Chicago area, but he did a lot of work in what's now Streeterville. He designed his trademark 900 North Michigan Avenue building, which is now where Bloomingdale's is. It's just a gorgeous classical building. He also designed the Lakeshore Athletic Club at 850 North Lakeshore Drive. He designed the Elmhurst State Bank building, which still stands right in downtown Elmhurst. The Lakeshore Athletic Club was saved by an alderman about 10 or 12 years ago who was voted in. The residents of Streeterville voted out an alderman who was very developer friendly. The new alderman immediately put a stop to the tearing down of that, and Lakeshore Athletic Club is now an apartment building. It's been wonderfully restored. Jarvis Hunt retired from commercial work in 1927. 1930, he bought some land on Camelback Road out in Scottsdale, Arizona. He built 2 adjacent houses, one of which is pictured here. Take a look at that. Isn't that just a gorgeous house? So he had another house right next door. The problem was during the Depression, times were tough. Jarvis Hunt owned a lot of land during those years, including in Chicago, properties that he'd hoped to develop. Unfortunately, he ended up insolvent. And the way I like to say it is he owned land at precisely the wrong time, which was the Depression when there was no demand. These problems led to his life in Arizona. He and his son had tried to develop a desert resort on their property. They were going to have a group dining room, a guest cottages, and a cocktail lounge. Unfortunately, that property was foreclosed on, and so he lost ownership of that. He returned to Chicago from time to time throughout the 1930s. When he was in the city, it's not known where he would stay, but he probably stayed at 900 North Michigan Avenue. What ultimately happened, he sold his final parcel in Wheaton. That was the house at 1S 785 Hawthorne Lane, the one I just showed you that was torn down. That was the final property he owned in Wheaton. After that, he would still stay in Wheaton. He probably crashed at the cottages at Chicago Golf. Unfortunately, like I said, those financial troubles continued. Arcadia Lodge in Scottsdale was foreclosed on. He lost it at a sheriff's auction in 1941. Less than 6 months later, Jarvis Hunt died. He's buried at a cemetery in his native Wethersfield, Bow, Vermont, and there's his gravestone. In the years after he passed away, what was striking was appreciation for his work built slowly. You had the Depression, you had World War II, you had this new form of postmodern architecture, and I don't think any of those dynamics helped the appreciation of his classical styles. I love this rare printed reminiscence that was published in 1956 in the Chicago Tribune. The article is called "Lively Ghosts Stalk Old Golf Course." It says here, on a quiet night when the wind whispers to itself in the tall old trees, one senses the presence of some lively ghosts. Jarvis Hunt Sr., who strode the course like a pirate captain on his quarterdeck, filling the air for miles with pungent phrases. But he was sort of a forgotten prophet in his own land. Between 1941 and the 1984 demolition of his home on Hawthorne Lane that I showed you, I don't know that his name ever appeared in the local paper, and it only rarely appeared in the Chicago newspapers. When 900 North Michigan Avenue was torn down, also in 1984, that was one of the first major events to really focus people on the significance of his work and the extensiveness of his work. So locally, we started to see him gain recognition in 1994. Leona Schmidt wrote a 10-page article about him for DuPage History magazine. And then one local Chicago Tribune reporter, I'm referring to myself, of course, began writing about his legacy starting in 1994 and 1995 when the Hunter's Glen subdivision was submitted and approved by the Wheaton City Council. That was on a good chunk of his 29-acre estate in Wheaton. Some more recent preservation efforts have really been successful, I think, at elevating his profile, both locally and across the Chicago area, and even nationally as well. So to wrap up, I'd like to just leave you with these takeaways. Jarvis Hunt was a prolific architect, both locally and nationally. His residential work was heavily focused on Wheaton. He designed a total of only four houses, for instance, in Chicago. He designed 3 in Riverside, 2 in Arizona, a few others in the Chicago area. There's 1 in Oak Park, for instance. But really, the vast majority of what he did residentially was done right here. He tended to have very well-heeled clients. Many of these were club connections, how he met them. And he was really the patron saint of this Wheaton colony of people who spent summers at Chicago Golf between, call it 1895 and the 1920s. He was an eclectic architect, but he really focused on classical styles. So earlier in his career, you saw shingle style, but later on you saw colonial revival, Georgian, and even some early prairie styles. That versatility gave Jarvis Hunt some flexibility. The record shows that for some commissions, he designed without much client interference, but other clients like Joy Morton and Kansas City Star publisher William Rockhill Nelson were very, very intimately involved in the design process, and he would submit to their wishes. So blessedly, much of Jarvis Hunt's Wheaton architecture still remains standing and should be a source of local pride. Lake Forest has David Adler, Oak Park has Frank Lloyd Wright, Hinsdale has Harold Zook. Wheaton has and should be proud of Jarvis Hunt. Thank you all very much.